Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Christopher Brennan had always believed that every mystery had a logical explanation. 23 years with the National Park Service, 15 of those as a senior investigator, had only reinforced this conviction. Missing hikers were found disoriented or injured. Strange sounds had natural sources. Unusual tracks belonged to known animals, just distorted by terrain or decomposition. The universe operated according to rules, and Christopher's job was simply to understand which rules applied. That certainty began to crack on a Tuesday morning in late October 2009, when he received the call about Rachel Morrison. The ranger station at Canyon de Chelly National Monument sat at the edge of Navajo Nation land, a modest building that had witnessed decades of tourists, sacred sites, and the occasional search and rescue. Christopher arrived at dawn, the Arizona sky still holding on to the deep purple of night. Inside, Junior Ranger Tommy Begay looked like he hadn't slept, his usually steady hands trembling slightly as he poured coffee. "She was supposed to check in yesterday at 4, Tommy said, spreading a map across the desk. Rachel Morrison, 31, experienced hiker. She had a satellite phone, GPS, everything. Was doing botanical surveys near Spider Rock." Christopher studied the map, his analytical mind already plotting search grids. "Family notified?" "Her sister in Albuquerque. She's the one who called us when Rachel missed their daily check-in." Tommy hesitated, and something in that pause made Christopher look up. The younger ranger's face had gone carefully neutral, the expression Christopher had learned meant discomfort among the Navajo staff. "Chris, there's something else. She left a voicemail for her sister around 3. I'm going to play it for you." The message started normally enough. Rachel's voice was cheerful, professional, describing a rare species of evening primrose she'd found. Then her tone shifted. "That's weird. There's someone, Steph, there's someone down in the canyon, but they're moving wrong. Like they're..." Static burst across the line, and when Rachel's voice returned, it was tight with something between confusion and fear. "That's not right. People don't move like that. Their legs are... Oh God, it's looking at me."
"Stephanie, its neck just..." The message ended abruptly. Christopher replayed it 3 times, his investigator's mind cataloging details. The timestamp put the call at 3:47 p.m. Rachel's GPS had stopped transmitting at 4:02 p.m., just 15 minutes later, near the base of Spider Rock. No distress signal, no further communication, just silence. "I want to be on site by full light," Christopher said, already mentally inventorying equipment. "Get me Rodriguez and Chen for the search team."
Tommy didn't move, his dark eyes fixed on Christopher with an intensity that felt like warning. "Chris, you know I respect you. You've been good to work with. But you need to know something before you go out there." He glanced toward the window, toward the vast expanse of sacred Navajo land beyond. "The elders in Chinle have been talking. They say something's been moving through the canyons. Wrong things. They say someone's been walking in a bad way." Christopher had heard variations of this before. Local legends, cultural beliefs that he'd learned to acknowledge respectfully while pursuing empirical evidence. "Tommy, I appreciate the cultural context, but right now we have a missing person. Whatever's out there, we'll deal with facts." "Facts?" Tommy's laugh was bitter. "My grandfather is a Hatali, a medicine man. He told me that when you see someone walking in a bad way, you don't look at them directly. You don't speak to them, and you sure as hell don't follow them." He paused. He also said that this time of year, when the veil is thin, they're hungry. Christopher felt a flicker of irritation. "I need you focused, Tommy. Get the team ready." But as he prepared his gear, radio, GPS, first aid kit, emergency beacon, Christopher couldn't quite shake the memory of Rachel's voice on that recording. "Their legs are..." What had she been trying to say? The sunrise revealed Canyon de Celli in all its austere beauty. Red sandstone walls rose 800 feet, carved over millennia into a labyrinth of side canyons and hidden valleys. Spider rock thrust upward like a skeletal finger pointing at heaven, sacred to the Navajo people, forbidden to climb. Christopher had been in these canyons hundreds of times, had navigated their treacherous terrain in all seasons, and he'd never felt what he felt now, a subtle wrongness in the air, like the pressure before a storm that never breaks. Rodriguez and Chen met him at the trailhead. Both experienced search and rescue. They descended into the canyon and practiced silence, following the coordinates from Rachel's last GPS ping. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of juniper and sage. Overhead, a raven circled, its harsh cry echoing off stone walls. They found Rachel's campsite intact, tent still standing, sleeping bag undisturbed, equipment organized with the precision of someone who'd done this many times. Her water bottles were full, food supplies untouched. The satellite phone sat on a flat rock, still powered on, displaying a battery at 37%. Christopher bagged it as evidence, his mind already working through scenarios. If she'd left in distress, why not take the phone? Why leave everything behind? Chris. Chen's voice was strained. You need to see this. 20 yards from the campsite, they found the first footprint. Christopher crouched beside it, pulling out his camera and measurement tools. The print was human, or appeared to be at first glance. Barefoot, roughly size 9, consistent with Rachel's build. But something about it triggered his analytical mind's warning systems. The depth was wrong, too deep in the heel, too shallow at the ball of the foot, as if the weight distribution was inverted, and the spacing between prints. She was running, Rodriguez said, following the track line with his eyes. No. Christopher's frown deepened as he measured the stride. This is nearly 6 feet between prints. That's not human running, that's something else. The tracks led deeper into the canyon, toward a side passage that narrowed between sheer rock walls. Christopher had been this way before, knew it dead-ended at a spring that the Navajo considered sacred. As they followed the prints, he noticed more anomalies. Occasionally, the footprints would be joined by what looked like handprints, but placed where feet should be. Then they'd shift back to bipedal. The pattern made no anatomical sense. Chen, normally unflappable, had gone pale. Boss, this isn't right. Document everything, Christopher said tersely, fighting his own growing unease. Facts, evidence, logical explanations. They found Rachel's jacket first, torn and discarded on a boulder. Then her GPS unit deliberately smashed, the screen spiderwebbed with cracks. Then, in a patch of red sand that held prints beautifully, Christopher saw something that made his breath catch. 2 sets of tracks. Rachel's normal human prints, running. And beside them, following them, something that walked on 2 legs but left prints that suggested the legs bent wrong, the knees hyperextended backward. He'd seen similar tracks exactly once before, in a textbook on gait abnormalities. But those had been medical rarities, not something you'd encounter chasing someone through a canyon. The tracks converged, became confused. Then only one set of prints led away, human-shaped but with that same unnatural depth distribution. Rodriguez keyed his radio. Base, this is Search Team Alpha. We've got a situation here. Evidence suggests our missing person may have encountered another individual. Requesting backup and... The radio erupted in static, then died completely. Christopher's GPS unit flickered, the screen scrambling. Chen's did the same. Within seconds, all their electronic equipment was dead or malfunctioning, including Christopher's usually reliable radio. Equipment failure, Christopher said automatically, though his hands were shaking slightly as he tried to restart his GPS. Must be some kind of localized electromagnetic... A sound echoed through the canyon. Human laughter, but wrong somehow, the pitch wavering like a poorly tuned instrument. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the stone walls, until Christopher couldn't determine its source. Then they saw her. Rachel Morrison stood at the entrance to the narrow passage, perhaps 50 yards away. She wore her hiking clothes, her dark hair pulled back in the ponytail visible in her case file photo. She waved at them, a normal gesture, friendly, beckoning them forward. Christopher felt relief flood through him. Rachel Morrison, are you hurt?" She didn't respond, just kept waving, that smile fixed on her face. Something about the smile bothered him. "Rachel, we're with the National Park Service. Stay where you are, we're coming to help." Chen grabbed his arm. "Don't." "What are you—" "She's right there, she's obviously—" "Look at her legs, Chris. Look at how she's standing." Christopher looked. At first he saw nothing wrong, then his analytical mind, trained to notice details, caught it. Rachel's knees. They were bending slightly the wrong way, hyper-extended backward in a way that human joints simply didn't move. And her neck, even from this distance, he could see it was tilted at an angle that suggested her head was turned further than anatomy allowed. "That's not Rachel," Rodriguez whispered. "Dios mío, that's not her." The thing that looked like Rachel cocked its head, the movement sharp and bird-like, too fast, rotating a full 90 degrees. Its smile widened and widened, stretching past what human facial muscles could achieve. Then it turned and walked into the narrow passage, its legs moving with that strange inverted gait, knees bending backward with each step. Christopher's rational mind scrambled for explanations. Optical illusion caused by distance and shadow, some kind of neurological condition causing abnormal movement, mistaken identity. Perhaps they'd found someone else, not Rachel at all. But he'd seen the jacket, he'd seen the equipment, and he'd heard that laugh. "We need to get back to base," Chen said, already backing away. "Now. We can't leave without—" "Christopher." Rodriguez's voice was flat, drained of its usual warmth. "I grew up near the Navajo reservation. My grandmother told me stories. When something looks like a person but moves wrong, when it tries to lead you somewhere alone, you don't follow it. Ever. That's a Yi Naldlushi, a skinwalker." The word hung in the air between them, and Christopher wanted to dismiss it, wanted to laugh and cite rational explanations. But his hands were still shaking, and his mind kept replaying that impossible rotation of Rachel's head, that backward bend of her knees. "Skinwalkers are mythology," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "There has to be a logical—" The laughter came again, closer now, from multiple directions. Christopher spun and saw figures standing on the canyon rim high above them, 3 of them silhouetted against the bright sky. They wore human shapes, but something about their proportions was subtly wrong. Limbs too long, heads too large. As he watched, one dropped from the 800-foot cliff face, simply stepped off and fell. It should have been fatal. Instead, it hit the canyon floor with a sound like breaking branches, then stood and began walking toward them with that lurching, wrong-jointed gait. Chen ran. Rodriguez followed. And Christopher, his rational worldview crumbling, ran too. They scrambled back toward the main canyon, equipment forgotten, following the wash that would lead them out. Behind them, Christopher could hear footsteps. Too many footsteps, moving too fast, and voices, calling to them in perfect English, using their names, asking why they were running, promising help just ahead. Rodriguez's grandmother's voice, Chen's dead brother, Christopher's ex-wife, voices that couldn't be there, shouldn't be there. Christopher risked a glance back and immediately wished he hadn't. The thing that had looked like Rachel was running on all fours now, its spine arched wrong, its head hanging beneath its body, neck impossibly extended, and it was gaining, closing the distance with each bound, moving faster than anything human could move. They reached the main canyon floor and ran for the trail that would take them up and out. Christopher's lungs burned, his 52-year-old body protesting this sprint. He heard Chen cry out and looked back to see the younger ranger on the ground. Someone, crouched over him. It wore Chen's face now, perfectly mirrored, and it looked up at Christopher with Chen's eyes while its hands, elongated and wrong, did something to Chen's body that made terrible wet sounds. Rodriguez pulled Christopher forward. "Don't look. Don't stop. They feed on fear, on attention, on—" A figure stepped out of the canyon wall itself, materializing from shadow and stone. It wore Rodriguez's face, his uniform, everything perfect except for the eyes, which were solid black from corner to corner. "Where are you going, amigo?" it asked in Rodriguez's voice, tilting its head at that sharp avian angle. "Don't you want to stay with me?" Rodriguez screamed and shoved past it, and Christopher followed, his rational mind finally, completely shattered. There was no logical explanation for this, no scientific framework that could encompass entities that wore human skins like costumes, that moved through stone, that mimicked voices and faces with perfect fidelity, while their bodies bent in ways that defied anatomy. They reached the trailhead as the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls blood red. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had faded, but Christopher knew with a certainty that went beyond logic, that they were being allowed to escape, that whatever hunted these canyons was playing with them, the way a cat plays with wounded prey. Tommy was waiting at the ranger station, his face grave. "Jen?" Christopher shook his head, unable to speak. His hands still trembled. His entire worldview had been disassembled in less than 3 hours. "I need to call this in," he finally managed. We need backup, federal resources. We need to seal off that canyon." "No." Tommy's voice was firm. "You call in federal agents, you bring more people here, you'll just give them more skins to wear, more faces to steal." He moved to the window, looking out at the darkening canyon. "This is Navajo land. This is a Navajo problem. I've already called the elders. They'll perform the proper ceremonies, lay the proper protections, but you..." He turned back to Christopher. "You need to leave. Tonight. And you need to forget what you saw. I can't just... Rachel is still out there, or what's left of her, and Chen... Rachel Morrison walked too close to places she shouldn't have walked. She looked at things she shouldn't have seen. And now something is wearing her skin, walking in her shape." Tommy's eyes were hard. Chen didn't know the old ways, didn't know not to let them catch him. "But you can still leave, so leave." Christopher wanted to argue, wanted to insist on proper procedures, investigation, evidence. But when he closed his eyes, he saw that thing with Rachel's face and backward knees, felt the wrongness of its movement, heard the wet sounds it had made while wearing Chen's face, and he packed his bags and drove away from Canyon to Chelly that night, Rodriguez beside him, both men silent. In his rearview mirror, Christopher saw figures standing on the road behind them, silhouetted in his taillights. They waved goodbye, friendly and human-shaped, until the darkness swallowed them. The official report listed Rachel Morrison as missing, presumed dead due to fall or exposure. Chen's death was ruled an animal attack, though no one could identify what animal. Christopher took early retirement 3 months later, claiming health issues. He moved to Maine, as far from the desert Southwest as he could manage, and tried to rebuild his rationalist worldview. But sometimes, in the gray light of pre-dawn, he sees figures standing at the edge of his property. They wear familiar faces. Rachel's, Chen's, even his own face sometimes, grinning at him from the tree line. They move with that characteristic wrong-jointed gait, heads tilted at impossible angles, and they wave. Always waving, beckoning him closer. Christopher keeps his doors locked and his windows covered. He doesn't go out after dark. And he never, ever waves back, because he knows now, with the certainty that comes from having his rational worldview shattered and reassembled into something far more terrifying, there are rules to this universe, just as he'd always believed. But some of those rules were written in languages older than science, carved into the bones of the earth by forces that wore human faces only when it suited their hunger. And somewhere in the red canyons of Arizona, something still wears Rachel Morrison's skin, still walks in her shape, still calls out to hikers with her voice, waiting for the next person who believes mysteries always have logical explanations. The next person who will look when they shouldn't look, follow when they shouldn't follow. The next person who doesn't know the old ways, the old warnings, the old truths that Christopher Brennan learned too late. When you see someone walking in a bad way, you run. And you never ever stop running. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most? Robert Chen had stopped believing in monsters when he turned 12. Now, at 35, standing in the parking lot of Olympic National Park's ranger station with rain drumming against his bureau-issued sedan, he found himself wishing he'd never lost that childhood certainty. At least then, he would have had a framework for what he was about to encounter. The missing person case had landed on his desk 3 days ago with a bureaucratic thud that suggested routine. Charlotte Morrison, 28, park ranger, last radio contact 6 days prior, while conducting a solo patrol in the Ho rainforest backcountry. Her supervisor had waited the requisite 48 hours before escalating, expecting her to emerge with equipment failure and an apologetic smile. She hadn't. The local sheriff's office had conducted preliminary searches. They'd found her truck at a trailhead, keys in the ignition, and absolutely nothing else. What made the case federal was a detail buried in paragraph 7 of the initial report. Charlotte's last radio transmission had included the phrase, "Something's wrong with the Peterson party," referring to a family of 4 who'd obtained a backcountry permit 2 weeks earlier. When rangers finally located the Peterson campsite, they'd found it abandoned mid-meal, food still on plates, sleeping bags unzipped from the inside, and a smell that made 2 seasoned rangers vomit into the undergrowth. No bodies, no blood, just that smell, and claw marks on the trees that went up 20 feet. Robert locked his car and approached the ranger station, a modest building that seemed to huddle beneath the enormous Sitka spruces surrounding it. The Olympic Peninsula in late October was a study in gray. Gray sky, gray rain, gray mist that clung to the rainforest canopy like something alive. He'd read that the Ho rainforest received over 12 feet of rain annually, making it one of the wettest places in the continental United States. The moisture was already seeping through his jacket, and he'd been outside less than 3 minutes. Inside, Ranger Supervisor Michael Takota waited with the kind of stillness that Robert associated with people carrying heavy knowledge. Takota was Quileute, early 60s, with deep-set eyes that tracked Robert's movement across the room with an intensity that felt almost predatory. "Agent Chen." No handshake offered. "You made good time from Seattle." The report mentioned time-sensitive evidence degradation. Robert set his briefcase on the table between them, noting how Takota's office was decorated with maps but no photographs, documents but no personal effects. "I'd like to see the Peterson campsite first, then Charlotte Morrison's last known location. I'll take you to Charlotte's truck, the campsite." Takota paused, and something crossed his face that Robert couldn't quite classify. Not fear, exactly. Something older. "The campsite isn't safe right now. Contaminated," in a manner of speaking. Takota stood, reaching for a coat that looked like it had weathered 50 seasons. "Agent Chen, are you familiar with the indigenous peoples of this region?" Robert's analytical mind cataloged the question's strangeness. "Generally, Quinault, Quileute, Ho tribes. Why?" "Because Charlotte Morrison was." Takota's eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made Robert's skin prickle. "She spent 3 months with tribal elders last winter, documenting traditional stories. She knew the old rules, the taboos. When someone like Charlotte breaks radio silence to say something's wrong, she means something fundamentally wrong, not lost hikers or injured wildlife." The rain intensified as they drove deeper into the park, the road narrowing until it felt like the forest was actively trying to reclaim it. Takota navigated with the ease of decades, but Robert noticed how his eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, as if checking whether they were being followed. "The Quinault have a word," Takota said suddenly. "Tsik. It means the hungry one that walks. Most people think it's just their version of Bigfoot, a story to keep kids from wandering off. But the elders, the ones who still remember the old ways, they know it's not about keeping children safe. It's about keeping everyone away from something that should never be disturbed." Robert had dealt with enough cases in rural areas to recognize when local folklore was being introduced as evidence. "Mr. Takota, I respect traditional knowledge, but—" Charlotte's camera was in her truck. Takota interrupted. "SD card still inside. We pulled the photos before calling you. There's a reason this went federal so fast, and it's not bureaucratic procedure. They parked at a trailhead where yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the wind like prayer flags. Charlotte's truck sat exactly as described. Keys in ignition, driver's door ajar, and a wrongness that Robert could feel before he'd even approached it. His training kicked in. Observe, document, analyze. But his hindbrain, the part that evolution had honed over millions of years to recognize predators, was screaming at him to get back in the vehicle and drive until the rainforests were a memory. The truck's interior was meticulous. Maps folded perfectly, emergency supplies secured, a half-eaten granola bar on the dashboard that birds hadn't touched despite 6 days of exposure. Robert photographed everything, his movements mechanical, professional. Then Dakota handed him Charlotte's camera. The first dozen photos were routine. Landscape shots, evidence of trail maintenance, a family of elk grazing at dawn. Then the images changed. Photo 37 showed a clearing Robert didn't recognize, and in its center, a structure that made his analyst's brain stutter. It looked like a hunting blind, but wrong. The proportions were off, the materials bizarrely chosen, bones interwoven with branches, and was that hair, human hair? Photo 38, closer now, and Robert could see symbols carved into the surrounding trees. Not random graffiti, but deliberate patterns that repeated with unsettling precision. His fingers trembled slightly as he advanced to the next image. Photo 39 made him understand why this had gone federal. The structure's interior was visible, and hanging from its ceiling were objects that his mind initially refused to classify as human remains because accepting that meant accepting something impossible. They'd been stripped and arranged with terrible purpose, and scattered around them were items that didn't belong to the 21st century. Clay vessels, stone tools, and what looked like ceremonial masks that predated European contact by centuries. But it was photo 40 that stopped his breathing entirely. Charlotte had photographed something emerging from the tree line. The image was slightly blurred, as if she'd been shaking, but the shape was unmistakable in its impossibility. Tall, easily 8 feet, and skeletal in a way that suggested starvation taken past death and into something else. Its skin had a grayish pallor that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, and its eyes. Robert zoomed in on those eyes. They weren't animal. They weren't human. They were aware in a way that made the photograph feel like it was looking back at him. The last photo, Dakota said quietly, was taken at 3:47 p.m. 6 days ago, approximately 4 miles north of here. Her radio call came in at 4:02 p.m. In 15 minutes, she traveled 4 miles through terrain that should take 2 hours to traverse, and her voice on that recording. He paused. The dispatcher said she sounded hungry. Robert's analytical mind assembled the facts with mechanical precision. Unexplained disappearances, evidence of ritualistic activity, photographs suggesting an unknown presence in the forest, and Charlotte Morrison, an experienced ranger, fleeing toward her truck with something pursuing her. The logical explanation would involve a cult, perhaps survivalists who'd established an illegal settlement in the backcountry. The photographs could be staged. The structure could be some twisted art project. The figure could be a person in costume, except nothing about the evidence supported that. The bones in that structure had weathered for years, possibly decades. The symbols carved into the trees showed growth patterns that indicated they'd been there since at least the 1970s. And the figure in the photograph had been captured in the middle of a step, its leg extended in a biomechanically impossible angle that no costume could achieve. "I need to see that clearing," Robert heard himself say. Dakota nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this. "There's something you should know first. The Quileute word for what's in those woods is Wetiko. The Algonquian tribes farther east call it Wendigo. Different languages, same entity. It's not a creature, Agent Chen, it's a punishment. A curse that transforms someone who commits certain violations, particularly cannibalism, but also other taboos, into something that can never be satisfied, something that hungers eternally." "Folklore," Robert said, but the word felt hollow even as it left his mouth. "The Peterson family," Dakota continued as if Robert hadn't spoken, "obtained their backcountry permit on October 2nd. They were experienced campers, well supplied for 2 weeks. On October 7th, A winter storm hit unexpectedly. Temperatures dropped below freezing overnight. On October 9th, their expected check-in was missed. Rangers found their campsite on October 11th. He paused. There was a smell. Meat that had been cooked. But no remains, and all their food supplies were intact and untouched. The implication hit Robert like ice water. I think they got desperate. I think they broke a taboo that's existed in these forests for thousands of years, and I think Charlotte Morrison found evidence of what they became. They hiked in silence, Dakota leading with the confidence of someone who'd walked these trails in the dark. The rainforest closed around them like a fist. Massive trees draped with moss, ferns erupting from every surface, and a silence that felt unnatural. Robert's analytical mind noted the absence of bird calls, the way even the rain seemed to fall more quietly here. But another part of him, the part that still remembered being 12 and afraid of the dark, recognized the silence for what it was. Predator territory. The clearing appeared without warning, a wound in the forest where nothing grew. Robert's first thought was contamination, but soil contamination didn't explain the arrangement of the space. The structure from Charlotte's photos stood in the center, and approaching it felt like walking against a physical force. His legs moved, but every instinct screamed at him to stop. Up close, the construction was worse. The bones were human. He could see that now, and they'd been arranged with terrible intelligence. Not randomly, but according to some principle that his mind couldn't grasp but his body recognized as profoundly wrong. The symbols carved into the surrounding trees were deeper than he'd thought, cut with something sharp enough to penetrate 3 inches into living wood. Dakota stayed at the clearing's edge, his face expressionless, but his knuckles white, where they gripped his walking stick. The Kinols say you can feel it in places where the boundary is thin, where the spirit world presses against ours. This is one of those places, Agent Chen. It has been for a long time. Robert photographed everything with methodical precision, but his hands were shaking. The structure's interior contained items that should have been in a museum, pottery that could have been 500 years old, tools that predated metalworking, and masks whose empty eye sockets seemed to track his movement. But scattered among them were modern objects: a cell phone, its screen shattered, a GPS unit, its casing cracked, and a ranger's badge that Robert recognized from Charlotte's personnel file. She'd been here, she'd seen this, and then she'd run. The sun was setting when Robert noticed the tracks. He'd been so focused on the structure that he'd missed what surrounded it. Footprints in the soft earth, dozens of them, all converging on this spot. But they weren't normal footprints. They started human-sized at the clearing's perimeter, but as they approached the structure, they changed, lengthened, deepened. By the time they reached the center, they were easily twice the size of his own boots, and the stride between them suggested something that could cover 20 feet in a single step. "We need to leave," Dakota said, his voice tight with an emotion Robert was starting to share. Now, before dark. But it was already too late. The sound started low, a clicking that Robert's brain initially classified as insects. But insects didn't make sounds that reverberated in your chest cavity. Insects didn't make sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, that bypassed your ears and resonated directly in your bones. Something was circling the clearing. Robert's hand went to his service weapon, and the absurdity of that gesture hit him with the force of revelation. What was he going to do, arrest it? Read it its Miranda rights. The thing in Charlotte's photograph hadn't looked like something that cared about federal law. "Don't run," Dakota whispered. "For the love of God, don't run. Running triggers the chase reflex. Stand your ground." The clicking intensified, and Robert saw movement in the tree line. Not just one figure, multiple figures, all moving with that same impossible fluidity. His mind tried to count them, tried to catalog their positions, but they kept shifting, appearing in one spot and then another, 20 feet away without seeming to cross the intervening space. Then they stopped. Complete silence descended on the clearing, more absolute than anything Robert had experienced. Even his own heartbeat seemed muffled, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The largest figure stepped into view. Robert's training had prepared him for violent criminals, for terrorists, for the worst that humanity could produce. It had not prepared him for this. The thing that emerged from the tree line had once been human. He could see the echo of human proportions in its frame, but it had been transformed into something that violated every rule of biology he knew. Its skin was stretched taut over bones that seemed too long, too angular, and it moved with a grace that was beautiful and horrifying in equal measure. But it was the hunger in its eyes that broke something fundamental in Robert's worldview. This wasn't animal hunger, the simple need of a predator for prey. This was existential hunger, the aching void of something that had been empty so long it had forgotten what satisfaction felt like, and it was looking at him with terrible intelligence, evaluating, calculating. "Charlotte Morrison," Robert said, his voice steady despite the terror flooding his system. "I'm looking for Ranger Charlotte Morrison." The thing's head tilted with a sound like cracking ice. When it spoke, the voice was wrong. Too many tones layered over each other, as if a dozen throats were producing sound simultaneously. "Charlotte." The name came out distorted, chewed. Charlotte fed us. Charlotte understood. Charlotte joined us. One of the other figures stepped forward, and Robert's analytical mind shattered completely. This one was fresher, more recently transformed. It still wore tattered remains of a park ranger's uniform, and on its chest, barely visible through the decay, was a name tag. Morrison C. She'd been missing 6 days. The transformation should have taken weeks, months. But time seemed to move differently in this clearing, in this space where the boundary was thin. Charlotte's face, what remained of it, turned toward him, and for a moment Robert saw awareness flicker in those hungry eyes. Recognition. And then it was gone, drowned in that endless, terrible hunger. "The Petersons broke the taboo," Dakota said, his voice hollow. "They ate of human flesh to survive the storm. The curse took them fast. But Charlotte came to investigate. She breathed the air here. She touched the remains. The hunger is contagious, Agent Chen. It spreads like disease, but faster. And once it takes hold..." Robert's weapon was in his hand, though he didn't remember drawing it. The gesture was absurd. What was he going to do, shoot folklore? But the weight of it was comforting. A talisman of the rational world he was desperately trying to hold on to. "We can help you," he heard himself say, speaking to the thing that had been Charlotte Morrison. "There are treatments, psychiatric facilities." The sound that came from the creatures was laughter, but wrong, filtered through throats that had forgotten how human laughter worked. They moved closer, a slow tightening of the circle, and Robert understood with crystalline clarity that he was about to die in a way that wouldn't even leave remains for a proper burial. Dakota's hand closed on his arm with surprising strength. "There's one way to survive this," he whispered. "One rule the old stories agree on. You have to offer them something they want more than they want you. What could they possibly want more than food? Release." Dakota's eyes were bright with something that might have been tears, or might have been the reflection of the dying light. They're trapped in hunger that can never be satisfied. Every moment is agony. Every breath is torture. The mercy of death is the only gift they understand anymore. Robert looked at the creatures surrounding them, 6, maybe 7, he'd lost count, and saw the truth in Dakota's words. Behind the hunger in their eyes was something worse. Awareness. They knew what they'd become. They remembered being human, and they were begging for it to end. His weapon felt impossibly heavy in his hand. "I can't," he whispered. "They're victims. They're not. They're already dead, Agent Chen. Their bodies are still moving, but everything that made them human is gone, devoured by the hunger. What you'd be killing are just the shells, and you'd be doing them the greatest kindness possible." The creatures were close now, close enough that Robert could smell them. A scent like spoiled meat and burning hair and something else, something his brain refused to classify. Close enough that he could see the intelligence in their eyes warring with the hunger, could see them fighting against what they'd become and losing, always losing. Charlotte Morrison reached toward him with hands that had too many joints, and Robert saw his death in that gesture. But he also saw something else. Pleading. She was asking him to end it. His finger tightened on the trigger. The gunshot was obscenely loud in the clearing silence, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Charlotte Morrison's body jerked, a hole appearing in her chest that should have been instantly fatal. But she didn't fall. She stood there, looking down at the wound with something like curiosity, and then back at Robert with those terrible eyes. The hunger made them strong. It made them fast. It made them nearly impossible to kill. Nearly. "The head," Dakota shouted. "Destroy the brain. It's the only way." Robert fired again, and this time, Charlotte Morrison fell. The other creatures screamed, a sound that wasn't quite human and wasn't quite animal, and rushed forward. Robert's training took over, target acquisition and precise shots. But there were too many, and they were too fast. Claws raked his shoulder, opening his jacket and the flesh beneath in one smooth motion. Pain exploded through his system, but he kept firing, kept moving, kept fighting against the impossible. One creature fell, then another. But they were dragging him down, their strength overwhelming, and he could feel their hunger like a physical force, trying to hollow him out from the inside. Dakota was there suddenly, a knife in his hand that looked like it had been old when Columbus landed. The blade was obsidian, and it moved through the creatures like they were made of smoke, cutting something deeper than flesh. Where it struck, they screamed and fell and didn't rise. "Spirit knife," Dakota gasped, fighting back to back with Robert. "Blessed by 3 generations of elders. It's the only thing I've carried since Charlotte went missing, hoping I wouldn't need to use it." Together, they fought with the desperation of men who understood they were battling something that shouldn't exist but did anyway. Robert's bullets and Dakota's knife carved through the creatures until finally, the clearing was silent, except for their ragged breathing. 7 bodies lay in the dirt, returning slowly to dust as if their cells were giving up the fight to remain solid. Charlotte Morrison's face was peaceful in death, more peaceful than it had been in those final transformed moments. Robert wanted to feel relief. Instead, he felt only horror at what they'd been forced to do. "We have to burn this place," Dakota said, his voice shaking. "Burn it all. The structure, the remains, everything. And then we seal this area, make it officially off limits. No one can be allowed to come here again." Robert nodded mutely, his analytical mind trying and failing to process what had just happened. He'd shot 7 victims of what? Curse? Disease? Mass psychosis? His training had no framework for this. The FBI manual didn't have a chapter on supernatural transformations. As they worked to gather fuel for the fire, Robert found Charlotte's camera again, this time with a note wrapped around it, her handwriting shaky but legible. "If anyone finds this, the hunger is real. It's always been real. The old tribes knew. They tried to warn us. Don't investigate the disappearances. Don't touch the remains. Don't breathe the air near the places of transformation. The hunger spreads, it spreads so fast I can feel it in me now, growing, consuming. By the time you read this, I won't be Charlotte Morrison anymore. I'll be something else, something hungry. Please, end it. Don't let me hurt anyone else." The note was dated 3 days after her disappearance. She'd known what was happening to her. She'd tried to warn them, and she'd asked for exactly what they'd given her. Release. They watched the clearing burn as night fell completely, the flames reaching high into the dark sky. The fire consumed the structure, the remains, the cursed ground itself. But Robert knew it was just containment, not solution. The hunger was still out there, waiting in other forgotten places where the boundary was thin. When they finally left, hiking back to the ranger station by flashlight, Dakota spoke once more. "You'll file a report. You'll make it sound reasonable, explainable. Gas leak, toxic exposure, mass delusion from contaminated water. Whatever bureaucratic explanation lets people sleep at night. But you'll know the truth now. You'll carry it with you, and you'll understand why the old tribes had taboos, why they had forbidden places, why they had rules that seemed superstitious to outsiders." Robert wanted to argue, to assert his faith in rational explanation. But he couldn't. He'd seen too much, felt too much. The hunger had touched him in that clearing, had tried to take root in his mind, and he could still feel its echo, a small voice whispering that he was empty, that he needed to fill himself, that satisfaction was just one terrible act away. He would file his report. He would use the rational explanations Dakota suggested. He would close the case and move on to the next one. But late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, he would remember Charlotte Morrison's eyes in those final moments. Human awareness trapped inside something inhuman, begging for mercy. And he would understand with terrible certainty that there were things in the deep forests that civilization had tried to forget, but that had never forgotten us. Things that waited in places where the boundary was thin, where hunger could take root and transform and spread. The Olympic National Park officially closed the northern Hoh rainforest sector 2 weeks later, citing soil contamination from illegal dumping. The closure was supposed to be temporary. It became permanent. And if hikers occasionally reported strange sounds from deep in the restricted area, or if rangers sometimes found tracks that didn't match any known animal, well, those reports were filed away and forgotten. Robert Chen returned to Seattle and requested a transfer to white-collar crime. His superiors approved without question, noting in his file that he seemed to have lost his enthusiasm for fieldwork. They had no way of knowing that he still checked the Park Service databases every night, looking for missing person reports, for unexplained disappearances, for any sign that the hunger was spreading. Most nights, there was nothing. But sometimes there were patterns. Disappearances clustered around old-growth forests, abandoned campsites with food left untouched, radio transmissions that ended with phrases like "something's wrong" or "they're so hungry," or simply screaming that cut off mid-cry. And on those nights, Robert Chen would sit in his apartment with all the lights on, trying not to think about how easy it would be for the hunger to spread, trying not to remember the desperate pleading in Charlotte Morrison's eyes, trying not to hear the voice that still whispered sometimes in the back of his mind, telling him he was empty, so empty, and wouldn't it be so easy to fill that void? He never did. But he understood now why the old tribes had taboos. He understood why they had forbidden places, and he understood that some hungers once awakened could never truly be satisfied, only endured. If this story gave you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in Robert's place? Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most? Tentar novamente. Claude pode cometer erros. Confira sempre as respostas. The radio crackled with static before dispatch's voice cut through. Ranger Hayes, we've got a missing hiker report. Tyler Martinez, 26-year-old male, failed to return from the Alum Cave Trail yesterday evening. Vehicle still at the trailhead. Families getting anxious. Chris Hayes pressed the transmit button on his truck's radio, squinting through the windshield at the thick morning fog blanketing the Smoky Mountains. 3 weeks into his transfer from Yellowstone, and he still felt like a stranger in these ancient Appalachian woods. Copy that. I'm 15 minutes out. Chris, dispatch continued, and he caught the hesitation in her voice. Be careful up there. That area, just keep your radio on, okay? He'd heard the whispers in the ranger station. The Smokies had a reputation. Over 1,000 people documented missing in the park's history, more than any other national park in America. But Chris didn't believe in mountain superstitions. He believed in hypothermia, bear attacks, and people making stupid decisions in the wilderness. The fog grew denser as he drove higher into the mountains, his headlights barely penetrating the gray wall. When he reached the Alum Cave trailhead, Tyler Martinez's blue Honda Civic sat alone in the gravel lot, beads of moisture covering its windows like tears. Chris grabbed his pack, checked his radio one more time, and started up the trail. The forest pressed in immediately, rhododendron thickets creating tunnels of green that swallowed the path. Somewhere in the canopy above, a bird called out, a sound Chris didn't recognize, sharp and almost human. The fog clung to everything, muffling the world until even his own footsteps seemed distant and unreal. He'd studied the trail maps obsessively since arriving, trying to compensate for his outsider status. Alum Cave Trail was popular, well-maintained, 5 miles to the bluffs with a clear path. People shouldn't disappear here. And yet the park's missing persons list kept growing, a fact his colleagues mentioned with resigned acceptance, as if the mountains themselves were hungry. 2 miles in, Chris found the first sign. A blue bandana tied around a tree branch, fluttering weakly in the breeze. He photographed it, marked the GPS coordinates. Tyler's family had mentioned he wore a blue bandana, but something about it bothered Chris. The knot was elaborate, decorative almost, not the hasty tie of someone marking their path. Dispatch, I've got possible evidence at mile marker 2.3. Blue cloth, could be the missing hikers. Static answered him. He adjusted the radio, tried again. Nothing but white noise. The fog, probably, interfering with the signal. Chris continued up the trail, but a prickling sensation crawled up his spine, the feeling of being watched by something just beyond the gray curtain of mist. The second marker appeared a half-mile later. Another bandana, this one tied to a rhododendron branch well off the trail. Chris stepped into the undergrowth to examine it, and his boots sank into soft earth that squelched like wet flesh. The smell hit him then. Not decay exactly, but something organic and wrong, like flowers rotting in standing water. He photographed the bandana and noticed something that made his stomach tighten. Tiny scratches on the branch, deliberate marks that almost looked like symbols. He traced them with his finger, curved lines that reminded him of antlers, or reaching hands. Chris tried the radio again. Dead static. He checked his cell phone. No service. Expected this deep in the park. The isolation settled over him like a physical weight. In Yellowstone, he'd always had backup close by, other rangers who knew the land and its moods. Here, he was alone in a forest that predated European contact by millennia, walking trails the Cherokee had walked before Andrew Jackson forced them west on the Trail of Tears. The third bandana hung from a dead tree, its bark blackened and peeling. This time, Chris didn't need to step closer to see the wrongness. The fabric was shredded, torn by something with claws, and the tree trunk bore deep gouges that revealed white wood beneath. Not bear marks, too deliberate, too patterned. The scratches formed those same curved symbols, repeated over and over like obsessive prayer. "Tyler!" Chris called out, his voice swallowed immediately by the fog. "Tyler Martinez, Forest Service." Silence answered. Then, distant and distorted, he heard what might have been a response. A voice calling back. But the words were incomprehensible, stretched and strange like a recording played at the wrong speed. The sound came from deeper in the forest, far from the maintained trail. Every instinct Chris had developed in 15 years of wilderness work screamed at him to turn back, call for backup, wait for conditions to improve. But Tyler Martinez had already been missing for over 24 hours. In these mountains, with overnight temperatures dropping into the 40s, that could be a death sentence. Chris marked his position, noted the time, 10:47 a.m., and pushed into the undergrowth, following the direction of that distorted voice. The forest changed as he left the trail behind. The rhododendrons grew thicker, their waxy leaves creating a claustrophobic maze. The fog seemed alive here, moving against the wind, curling around tree trunks like searching fingers. Chris's compass began spinning slowly, the needle refusing to settle. He tapped it, checked for interference. Nothing that should cause this kind of malfunction. He found the clearing 20 minutes later. The fog lifted slightly in the open space, revealing a circle of dead grass roughly 30 feet in diameter. At the center stood a structure that made Chris stop cold. Branches woven together in a dome shape, covered with leaves and what looked like... He stepped closer, his hand instinctively moving to the bear spray on his belt. Animal pelts. Deer hides stretched over the frame, but arranged in a way that seemed intentional, almost ceremonial. The skulls were still attached, eyeless sockets staring outward in all directions. 7 of them positioned at cardinal and ordinal points like a compass rose. "Jesus," Chris whispered. Some kind of hunting blind, maybe, but the design was all wrong, too elaborate, too purposeful. And the smell, that same rotting flower scent, stronger now, making his eyes water. His boot struck something half buried in the dead grass, a leather journal, swollen with moisture. Chris picked it up with trembling hands and opened it. The handwriting was frantic, deteriorating from neat script on the first pages to barely legible scrawls near the end. Day 3 in the mountains. Beautiful hike. Saw a woman on the trail. Most beautiful person I've ever seen. She smiled at me. I followed her off the path just to talk. The entries grew stranger. Day 4. Can't find the trail. My GPS isn't working. Neither is my compass. I keep seeing her through the trees. She's always just ahead, always smiling. Her eyes are so dark, like looking into deep water. Day 7 or 8. Can't remember. So hungry. The woman is closer now. She's wearing a deer hide. No, she is wearing a deer. No. God, I don't know what I'm seeing anymore. Her legs are wrong. They bend wrong. She wants me to follow her to the water. She says there's water. The symbols protect nothing. I tried to make them like she showed me, but they just bring her closer. She's not a woman. She's never been a woman. The old man at the gas station in Cherokee warned me. He said, don't follow the deer woman, don't let her catch your scent. If she calls your name, you're already gone. I laughed at him. Superstitious bullshit. But her hooves on the dead leaves sound like... The entry ended mid-sentence. The remaining pages were covered in those curved symbols, drawn over and over until the paper tore. Chris's hands shook as he closed the journal. Tyler Martinez had written this. The handwriting matched the signature on the missing person report. But Tyler had only been missing for 1 day. This journal described over a week in the mountains. The fog thickened suddenly, rolling into the clearing like a living thing. Chris spun around, disoriented. Which direction had he come from? The dead grass circle looked the same in every direction, the skull-covered structure leering at him with empty sockets. Then he heard it. Hoofbeats. Slow and deliberate, circling the clearing just beyond the fog's edge. Not the quick patter of a startled deer. These were measured, purposeful, accompanied by something else. Something that sounded like a woman humming. "Tyler?" Chris called out, knowing it was wrong, knowing no human made that sound. The humming stopped. The hoofbeat stopped. In the sudden silence, a voice answered. Female, beautiful, with an accent Chris couldn't place. Christopher Hayes, from Yellowstone, the outsider. "You don't belong here." Ice flooded his veins. "Who are you? Where's Tyler Martinez?" Laughter, melodic and terrible. "Tyler stays. Tyler followed me willingly. Saw beauty and wanted to possess it, like all men. But you..." The fog parted slightly, and Chris saw movement. "You, I can smell your loneliness. New to these mountains. No friends here. No one who'd miss you. Perfect." A shape materialized in the mist. At first, Chris saw a woman. Tall, impossibly beautiful, with long dark hair and eyes like polished obsidian. She wore what looked like a buckskin dress decorated with beadwork. But as she stepped closer, the image fractured. Her legs were wrong, jointed like a deer's back legs, ending in cloven hooves. The dress wasn't a dress, but her skin, fur, and flesh merged seamlessly, and her smile revealed too many teeth, pointed and sharp. "Dear woman," Chris breathed, remembering fragments of stories he'd heard in the ranger station, dismissed as folklore. A spirit from Native American mythology, a shapeshifter who lured men to their deaths. Some said she punished those who disrespected women. Others claimed she was simply a predator, ancient and hungry. "You know the old stories," she said, pleased. "Good. Then you know running is useless." Chris stumbled backward, his hand closing on the bear spray. The creature laughed, that same musical sound that made his bones ache with longing despite his terror. "Iron and chemicals can't touch me, outsider. I am older than your park service, older than your country. These mountains knew my hoof prints before your people stole them." She moved closer, and Chris saw the clearing wasn't empty. Behind her, partially obscured by fog, stood figures, 7 of them, matching the 7 skulls on the structure. They'd been men once. Now they were hollowed out, skins stretched over bones. eyes replaced by dark holes that wept black fluid. Their mouths hung open in permanent silent screams. One wore the tattered remains of hiking gear. Tyler Martinez, transformed in impossibly short time, added to her collection. "The mountains are thin here," Dear Woman said, circling Chris like a predator. The Cherokee knew. They left offerings, respected the boundaries. But you outsiders, you think you own these woods. Build your trails and visitor centers over sacred ground. The veil between worlds tears a little more each year, and we slip through the cracks. Chris's back hit a tree. The bark felt wrong under his palms. Too smooth, too warm, almost like skin. He jerked away and saw that the tree was carved with those same symbols, hundreds of them, and they seemed to writhe in his peripheral vision. "What do you want?" His voice came out hoarse. "Want?" She tilted her head, the gesture disturbingly bird-like. "I don't want, Christopher. I am. Like the mountains are. Like the fog is. You ask what the winter wants, what the storm wants. I take what wanders into my territory. I've taken for thousands of years. Your Tyler thought he could possess beauty, thought he could take what he desired. So I took him instead, kept him here where time flows like water, where one day becomes 7 becomes 70. And you?" She reached out with fingers that were too long, nails like black talons. "You're so lost already. No one here knows you. No one here would search long. If this story is giving you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in Chris's place?" Chris's radio crackled suddenly, violently. Through the static came a voice, dispatch, frantic. "Hayes, Chris, we're reading. Proximity alert. Cherokee." The transmission dissolved into screaming static that sounded almost like voices, chanting in a language Chris didn't recognize. Dear Woman hissed, recoiling. The radio's noise seemed to hurt her, and her beautiful face rippled, revealing something ancient and terrible underneath. Too many eyes, a mouth that opened like a flower filled with thorns. Chris ran. He crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at his face and clothes. Behind him the hoofbeats thundered, impossibly fast. The fog swirled and clutched, trying to drag him back. His lungs burned, legs pumping, every instinct screaming that death followed on cloven feet. He burst through a rhododendron thicket and nearly fell over a precipice. Chris skidded to a stop at the edge of a cliff he didn't recognize, overlooking a valley filled with fog so thick it looked solid. No cliff should be here, not on this trail. But the mountains had rearranged themselves, or he'd crossed into somewhere else, somewhere the maps didn't show. The hoofbeats stopped. Chris turned slowly. Dear Woman stood 10 feet away, but she'd changed. Grown. She towered 8 feet tall now, her deer aspects dominating. Massive antlers sprouted from her skull, her face elongated into something between woman and animal, beautiful and grotesque. The other figures shuffled behind her, Tyler's fresh corpse puppet among them. "You can't leave," she said, voice echoing with unnatural harmonics. "The mountains claim you now, just like they claimed all the others. Your name is already written in the soil." Chris's hand found the journal in his jacket pocket. Tyler's journal, filled with those obsessive symbols. The symbols Tyler had tried to use for protection, but had only drawn her closer. "Unless you showed him these marks," Chris said, thinking fast, stalling. "You taught him to make them." She smiled, revealing rows of teeth. "Clever outsider, yes. Marked himself like cattle, made it easier to find him, track him, own him. The symbols don't protect, they bind." Chris looked down at the journal, then at the radio on his belt, still emitting faint static. Dispatch's voice had hurt her. Modern technology, cutting through ancient magic, or not magic. She'd said the mountains were thin here, that the veil between worlds was tearing. Reality, bleeding through reality. He grabbed the radio and turned the volume to maximum, switching through channels rapidly. The static grew louder, more chaotic, and through it came voices. Other rangers calling to each other, hikers reporting in, the mundane chatter of the modern world. It created a wall of sound, ordinary and electric, and completely foreign to this timeless place. Dear woman shrieked, a sound like breaking glass and dying animals. She staggered back, her form flickering. Woman, dear, nightmare, woman again. The fog roiled and churned. The corpse puppets collapsed, strings cut, becoming just bodies again, released. The old world dies. Chris shouted over the static, backing toward the cliff edge. Your veil is tearing because we're everywhere now. Our voices fill the air. Our signals cross your sacred ground. You're not hunting me, you're drowning in modernity. Then I'll drag you down with me. She lunged impossibly fast. Chris jumped. He fell backward off the cliff, and the world inverted. The solid fog caught him, and he wasn't falling but floating, suspended in gray nothing. Around him he saw shapes in the mist, other lost hikers, suspended in time, trapped in the spaces between. Some looked fresh. Others were ancient, dressed in clothes from decades past. All reached toward him with desperate hands. But the radio kept screaming its static prayer, and the fog began to thin. Chris felt himself falling again, truly falling now, and he glimpsed the truth of this place. Not a mystical spirit realm, but a fold in reality itself. A pocket where the normal rules collapsed, where time pooled and predators from older ages could still hunt. He hit solid ground hard, knocking the wind from his lungs. When his vision cleared, Chris lay on the Alum Cave Trail, the maintained, normal, real trail. Above him, the fog was breaking up, revealing patches of blue sky. His radio crackled with normal traffic. Ranger Hayes, please respond. Chris, are you there? He grabbed the radio with shaking hands. I'm here. I found him. Tyler Martinez. Chris looked back the way he'd come. The forest looked normal now, just trees and rhododendron, no shifting fog or impossible clearings. But he knew if he went back, if he looked carefully, he'd find a body. Maybe 7 bodies. Send a recovery team, and dispatch. Don't send them alone. This area, there's something. We know, the voice said quietly. There's always something. That's why we tried to warn you. Chris made it back to the trailhead as the sun broke through completely, burning away the last of the fog. A team of rangers met him there. Local rangers, people who'd worked these mountains for years. They didn't ask many questions. They just nodded when he tried to explain about the clearing and the symbols and the woman who wasn't a woman. Dear woman, one old ranger said, a Cherokee man named Tom. My grandmother warned me about her, said she walks the old paths, claims those who wander off the trail. Used to be just the disrespectful ones, the ones who came to these mountains to take without giving back. But the veil's been tearing for years now. She's getting desperate, less choosy. He looked at Chris with sad, knowing eyes. These mountains are dying, Ranger. The old spirits along with them. Makes them dangerous. They found Tyler Martinez's body in the clearing Chris described, though it took 3 rangers with GPS to locate the spot, and they all agreed the area seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at it. Tyler looked like he'd been dead for weeks, not one day. The autopsy would call it exposure and dehydration, but Chris saw the marks on the body, those same symbols carved into the skin. They found 6 other bodies in the surrounding area, all missing persons from the past decade. The Park Service quietly closed that section of trail for environmental concerns. The media reported a tragic discovery of multiple lost hikers. No one mentioned impossible clearings or women with hooves. Chris requested a transfer back to Yellowstone a week later, but it was denied. We need people who've seen, his supervisor said, people who understand what they're really protecting against. You're not an outsider anymore, Chris. You've been marked by these mountains now. They'll remember you. That night, Chris sat in his ranger station cabin and listened to the forest outside. In the distance, impossibly distant but somehow clear, he heard hoofbeats, and under it, like a whisper carried on the wind, a woman's voice humming. The Smokies had claimed part of him after all. He understood now why the other rangers never seemed surprised by the disappearances, why they accepted the mountain's hunger as a fact of life. The veil was tearing, and things were slipping through, and all they could do was try to keep people away from the thin places where reality bent. Chris pulled out Tyler's journal and turned to a blank page. He began to write, documenting everything, knowing it was useless but needing to record it anyway. Maybe the next outsider who came here would find it. Maybe it would save them. Or maybe it would just be one more warning that no one believed until too late. Outside, the hoofbeats faded. But Chris knew she was still there, patient and eternal, waiting for the next person to wander off the trail. The mountains kept their secrets and fed their ancient hunger, and the modern world pressed in, tearing reality a little more each day. Some nights, when the fog rolled thick, Chris thought he could see her watching from the tree line, a beautiful woman with 2 dark eyes, wearing a dress that might be deerskin or might be something else entirely. She never came close, not anymore. But she watched, waited, reminded him that he'd crossed into her world and barely escaped. The mountains had let him go, but they'd never let him forget. And deep in the forest, where the old paths still remembered, 7 skulls decorated a structure made of branches and skin, and the symbols carved into the trees continued to writhe when no one was looking, binding the boundaries between worlds that grew thinner every year. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most? Christopher Hayes had never believed in superstition. In his 9 years with the United States Geological Survey, he'd mapped fault lines across 3 continents, spent months in isolated field stations, and slept in places most people would consider haunted. Every unexplained sound had a rational source. Every shadow had a physical cause. The natural world operated according to immutable laws, and Christopher's job was to document them with precision instruments and peer-reviewed methodology. That certainty died somewhere in the red dust of the Navajo Nation, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly when. Maybe it was the moment he found Lauren's camp, or maybe it was later, when he realized something was watching him from the ridgeline. Or perhaps it had been dying slowly since he'd first arrived in Monument Valley, and he'd simply been too stubborn to notice. The assignment had seemed routine. Lauren Martinez, a graduate student from the University of Arizona, had been conducting seismic surveys near the Utah-Arizona border as part of her dissertation on micro-earthquake activity. She'd been checking in via satellite phone every 48 hours, like clockwork, for 3 weeks. Then she'd missed a check-in, then another. Her thesis advisor had contacted the university. The university had contacted the USGS, and because Christopher was already in Flagstaff reviewing data from the San Francisco Peaks monitoring station, he'd been the logical choice to investigate. He'd driven out on a Tuesday morning in late October, the sky that impossible desert blue that made everything seem clean and simple. His truck kicked up rooster tails of rust-colored dust as he followed the access road past Goulding's Lodge and into the deeper backcountry. Lauren's last known coordinates put her about 15 miles into Navajo land, in a remote valley system the locals called Tsay-Be-Nzizgai, the Valley of the Rocks. Christopher had obtained the necessary permits, loaded his GPS with waypoints, and packed enough supplies for a 3-day search. The first sign that something was wrong came at mile marker 12, where an elderly Navajo man stood beside the road next to a battered pickup. Christopher slowed and rolled down his window. The man didn't smile. He was perhaps 70, wearing a worn denim jacket and a silver bracelet that caught the sunlight. "You going out to Tsay-Be-Nzizgai?" the man asked. His voice was rough, like sandpaper on wood. "Yes, sir. I'm with the USGS. We have a researcher who—" "I know about the girl. She shouldn't have been there." The old man's eyes were dark and unreadable. "Neither should you." Christopher felt a flicker of irritation. He'd dealt with access disputes before, landowners who resented government presence. "I have all the permits," he said, keeping his voice professional. "I'll be respectful of—" "It's not about permits." The man stepped closer to the truck, and Christopher caught the smell of sage smoke clinging to his jacket. "There are old places out there, places where—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Where the boundaries are thin. White people, you always want to measure and catalog everything. But some things shouldn't be measured. I appreciate your concern, Christopher said, but I have a job to do, a missing person to find. The old man studied him for a long moment. If you see something walking on four legs but standing like a man, don't look at it. If you hear someone calling your name at night, don't answer. And if you see eyes reflecting light where no animal should be, you drive away and don't come back. He stepped back from the truck. My grandson, he saw something out there last month. Won't talk about it now. Won't even say its name. Christopher wanted to dismiss it as local folklore, the kind of superstitious warnings he'd heard in a dozen different countries. But something in the old man's expression made him hesitate. It wasn't the theatrical fear of someone telling ghost stories. It was the quiet, absolute certainty of someone who'd seen something real. I'll be careful, Christopher said, and meant it, even if he didn't believe. The old man nodded slowly. You have a weapon? I have bear spray. That won't help. He turned back to his truck, then paused. The Navajo, we have a word. Yi Naldlushi. We don't speak it lightly. If you're smart, you won't speak it at all. He climbed into his truck and drove away without another word, leaving Christopher alone on the dusty road with the red monuments rising around him like silent witnesses. Christopher drove on, the encounter settling uneasily in his stomach. He was a scientist. He dealt in measurable phenomena. But he'd been in enough remote places to know that local knowledge mattered. People who lived on the land for generations noticed patterns, even if they explained them in supernatural terms. The old man's warning might be rooted in superstition, but it probably indicated something real. Dangerous wildlife, unstable terrain, something. He reached Lauren's base camp 2 hours later. She'd set it up in a small canyon sheltered from wind by towering sandstone walls. Her tent was still standing, but the flap hung open, moving slightly in the breeze. Christopher parked 50 yards away and approached on foot, his field kit slung over his shoulder. The camp was wrong. That was his first thought. Immediate and visceral. He'd seen abandoned campsites before, and they all had a certain quality. The gradual entropy of human spaces returning to nature. But this was different. This looked interrupted. Lauren's sleeping bag was half out of the tent, as if she'd been dragged from it. Her cooking gear lay scattered across the fire ring, a pot overturned with the dried remains of what might have been soup coating the inside. Her field notebook sat open on a folding chair, pages fluttering in the wind. Christopher picked it up carefully, noting the date on the last entry, October 17th, 11 days ago. The handwriting started neat and scientific, typical field observations about seismic readings and geological formations. But as he flipped through the pages, he noticed the entries becoming more erratic. On October 15th, she'd written, "Unusual animal sounds at night. Coyotes? But the vocalizations are wrong. Mimicry pattern." The next day, found tracks near camp, canine, but gait is bipedal in places, possible injury or deformity. And then, on the 17th, the final entry, written in hasty, nearly illegible scrawl. "It knows I'm watching. It looked at me with his eyes. Need to leave. Need to..." The entry stopped mid-sentence. Christopher felt his heart rate increase. He was a geologist, not a search and rescue specialist, but he'd had enough wilderness training to recognize signs of mental distress. Heat exhaustion, dehydration, altitude sickness, all could cause paranoid delusions. But Lauren was experienced. She knew the protocols. He circled the camp, looking for more clues. Her seismograph equipment was still set up 100 yards away, the sensors properly placed, the data recorder blinking its steady green light. He checked the recordings, scrolling through days of information, mostly minor tremors, the kind of microseismic activity you'd expect in a geologically active area. But on October 16th, something odd, a rhythmic pattern, almost musical. Not an earthquake signature. It repeated every few hours for a full day, then stopped. Christopher downloaded the data to his laptop, frowning. The pattern was too regular to be natural, but what could create that kind of vibration? Heavy machinery? But there was nothing out here. Mining equipment would require roads, power. He made a note to analyze it more carefully later. The sun was starting to sink toward the horizon. painting the rocks in shades of orange and crimson. Christopher decided to search the immediate area before making camp. He followed a game trail leading away from Lauren's site, scanning for any sign of her passage. He found it a quarter-mile out, her GPS unit lying face down in the dirt. The screen was cracked, but when he picked it up, it still powered on. The last waypoint showed coordinates about 2 miles northwest, deep into the canyon system. He should call this in. That was protocol. But his satellite phone showed no signal. The canyon walls blocked transmission. He'd need to drive back to higher ground, and by then it would be dark. Christopher looked at the GPS coordinates, then at the darkening sky. 2 miles. He could make it there and back before full nightfall. Just a quick reconnaissance to see if Lauren had established a secondary camp. He grabbed his flashlight and started walking. The canyon narrowed as he progressed, the walls closing in until the sky was a ribbon of deep blue overhead. His boots crunched on gravel echoing off the stone. He'd gone maybe half a mile when he noticed the smell, something rotten, organic, like meat left in the sun. His first thought was a dead animal, mountain lion kill maybe. But the smell intensified as he walked, becoming almost overwhelming. He found the source in a small alcove where the canyon wall had collapsed, creating a shallow cave. Bones, dozens of them, scattered across the dirt. Christopher knelt, his scientific training overriding his revulsion. Deer mostly. The skulls were cracked open, the long bones splintered. Marrow extraction. That was normal predator behavior. But the sheer quantity disturbed him. And there was something else. The bones were arranged. Not randomly scattered, but placed in a rough circle, with what looked like symbols scratched into the larger pieces. Human symbols. Deliberate marks. Christopher took photographs, his hands steady despite the cold fear spreading through his chest. This wasn't animal behavior. Someone had done this. Some person had collected these bones and arranged them in this pattern. He thought of the old man's warning, of Lauren's final journal entry. A rational explanation existed. Had to exist. Maybe Lauren had found this, had been disturbed by it, had fled in panic. Maybe she'd stumbled, hit her head, was lying injured somewhere ahead. He continued walking, now moving faster, urgency overriding caution. The GPS coordinates were close, just around the next bend. The canyon opened into a small valley, maybe 200 yards across, surrounded by sheer walls. And there, in the center, he saw her tent. A second camp just like the first, but this one was pristine, neat, untouched. Christopher approached slowly. Something was very wrong. Why would Lauren establish a second camp so close to the first? Why had she left the first one in such disarray but kept this one immaculate? He called out her name. His voice echoed off the rocks, came back distorted, and for a moment it sounded like someone else was answering, mimicking his words in a slightly different pitch. The tent was empty. But inside he found her equipment, her laptop, her personal gear, her wallet with her university ID smiling up at him from the photograph. People didn't abandon these things, not willingly. He checked her laptop. It was password protected, but the power light blinked, showing battery charge. She'd been here recently, within the last few days. A sound made him turn. From somewhere in the valley, a voice called, "Christopher." He froze. It was Lauren's voice. He was certain, but it came from the wrong direction, from the canyon wall where nothing could be. And there was something hollow about it, like it was coming from very far away and very close simultaneously. "Lauren?" he called back. "Christopher." The voice repeated his name, but it was changing now, becoming lower, rougher. "Christopher, I need help." Every instinct screamed at him not to respond. He remembered the old man's warning. If you hear someone calling your name at night, don't answer. But it was still afternoon, the sun not yet set, and this was Lauren, his colleague, possibly injured. He moved toward the voice. It came from a narrow cleft in the canyon wall, a crack barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "Lauren, where are you?" He shined his flashlight into the darkness. The beam caught something reflective, 2 points of light about 6 feet off the ground. Eyes, but they were too far apart, too high up for a human. And they didn't blink. Christopher stepped back. The rational part of his mind supplied explanations. An animal, a coyote or fox, distorted by perspective. But another part, the part that operated on instinct and pattern recognition, knew he was looking at something wrong. The eyes moved, tracking him, and he heard breathing from the cleft. Deep, wet, like something with damaged lungs. "Christopher." The voice came again, but now it was beside him, to his right, where nothing had been a moment before. He spun, bringing his flashlight around, and caught a glimpse of something that made his mind stutter. It was on 4 legs, but the legs were wrong, jointed in places they shouldn't be. The body was covered in fur, but the fur was patchy, revealing skin underneath that was too pale, too smooth. And the head, God, the head. It turned toward him, and the face was almost human, but the mouth opened too wide, showing too many teeth. And those eyes, those same reflective eyes, looked at him with something that wasn't animal intelligence and wasn't quite human either. Christopher ran. Pure terror overrode logic. He bolted back through the valley, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart hammering. Behind him he heard movement. The sound of something large keeping pace, but not on 2 legs or 4. Something in between. Something that scraped and clicked against the stone. He didn't look back. Couldn't look back. The canyon stretched before him, shadows lengthening. His flashlight beam jerked wildly as he ran, casting crazy shadows on the walls. He heard his name again, called in his mother's voice, then his ex-wife's, then Lauren's again, each iteration becoming more distorted, more wrong. The rational part of his mind, the part that still functioned, knew this was impossible, knew there had to be an explanation. Hallucination from heat stroke, maybe. Carbon monoxide poisoning from a geological vent. Something. Anything. But the primal part, the part that had kept humans alive for millennia, knew he was being hunted. He burst into Lauren's original camp as the sun touched the horizon. His truck sat where he'd left it, solid and real. He fumbled for his keys, hands shaking so badly he dropped them twice. Behind him, at the canyon entrance, something moved. Something large. He saw it in his peripheral vision. A shape that was all wrong, that hurt to look at directly. Like his brain refused to process what his eyes were reporting. Christopher got the truck started, threw it into reverse and floored the accelerator. Gravel sprayed. The truck fishtailed. In the rearview mirror, he saw it standing in the middle of the camp, upright now, impossibly tall, with arms that hung too low, and a head that tilted at an angle that would break a human neck. It watched him go. Didn't chase. Just watched. And somehow that was worse. He drove for 20 minutes before his hands stopped shaking enough to hold the wheel steadily. The sun had set, and his headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness. He tried to organize his thoughts, to apply scientific method to what he'd seen. Rule out the impossible. What remained, however improbable, must be the truth. But he couldn't rule out anything. He'd seen it. The thing in the canyon. Whatever it was. His phone finally found signal when he reached the main road. He pulled over, his hands still trembling, and dialed the local sheriff's office. The dispatcher listened to his report. Missing person, abandoned camp, urgent search needed, without comment. But when he mentioned the location, she went quiet. "Sebi Nzizgai," she said finally. "You were at Sebi Nzizgai." "Yes, we need search and rescue out there immediately. Lauren Martinez, she..." "Sir, I'm going to transfer you to Officer Begay. Don't hang up." The line clicked. Christopher waited, watching the darkness beyond his headlights. Something about the way she'd said the place name made his stomach twist. That same quiet certainty he'd heard in the old man's voice. "This is Officer Begay." The new voice was younger, professional. "You reported a missing person?" Christopher gave him the details, trying to keep his voice steady, trying not to sound crazy. He didn't mention what he'd seen. Not yet. Just the facts. Lauren's camp, the scattered equipment, The abandoned secondary site. And you searched how far into the canyon system? Big A asked. Maybe 2 miles. I found her second camp, but she wasn't there. I heard... He paused. How to explain without sounding insane? I heard sounds. I think something might have scared her off. Wildlife, maybe. Another pause. Mr. Hayes, I need you to stay on the main road. Don't go back to that area. A team will be out at first light. First light? But Lauren could be injured. She could... Mr. Hayes. Big A's voice was firm. Nobody goes into that canyon after dark. Nobody. Do you understand? Christopher understood. He understood that everyone here knew something he didn't. Something they wouldn't say directly. He thought of the bones in their circle, the symbols scratched into them. He thought of Lauren's journal entry. It looked at me with his eyes. What's out there? He asked quietly. The silence stretched so long he thought Begay had hung up. Then, my grandfather, he's a Hatawi, a medicine man. He told me once that some knowledge is dangerous, that speaking certain words can draw attention. The old ways, they're not superstition, Mr. Hayes. They're survival. Another pause. Stay on the main road. We'll call you with an update. The line went dead. Christopher sat in his truck, the engine running, the heater blowing warm air that did nothing for the cold in his bones. His laptop was in the back seat. He pulled it out, opened the seismic data he'd downloaded from Lauren's equipment. That strange rhythmic pattern on October 16th. He isolated it, ran it through analysis software. The frequency was wrong for geological activity. It was too complex, too structured. He ran a spectrographic analysis, and his breath caught. The pattern, when visualized, looked almost like speech, like syllables. He enhanced it, filtered out noise, and played it back through his speakers. A voice emerged from the static. Low, inhuman, speaking in a language he didn't recognize. But underneath it, barely audible, he heard Lauren screaming. Christopher closed the laptop with shaking hands. He should drive to the nearest town, should get somewhere with people and lights and locked doors. But he couldn't move. His mind kept circling back to what he'd seen, trying to fit it into his understanding of reality. Every explanation failed. Hallucination, but the recordings were real. Mass hysteria. But he was alone. Unknown predator. But nothing moved like that. Nothing looked like that. He pulled out his phone and searched for information about the area. The results were sparse. A few academic papers on Navajo folklore, warnings on hiking forums about getting permission before entering tribal lands. But one thread caught his attention. A discussion on a paranormal forum from 2004. Someone asking about experiences near Monument Valley. Most responses were typical internet nonsense, but one posted by someone with the username Bilagana No More read, "They're real." I was a skeptic too. Anthropology PhD, spent 2 years studying Navajo culture, thought I was enlightened and rational. Then I saw one. Near Shiprock. It was wearing my research partner's face, but the body was wrong, all wrong. He'd been missing for 3 days. They never found him. I left academia. Some things aren't meant to be studied. Some things study back. Christopher put down his phone. His hands were shaking again. He was a scientist. He'd built his entire worldview on empirical evidence, reproducible results, peer review. But here, in the darkness of the Navajo Nation, all his certainty was crumbling. He'd seen something. The recordings proved something had been there. Lauren's camp proved something had happened. The question wasn't whether something supernatural existed. The question was what he was going to do about it. He started the truck and drove toward Goulding's lodge. He'd wait for the search team. He'd provide his evidence. He'd help find Lauren, if she could be found. But he wouldn't go back into that canyon. Not at night. Not ever, if he could help it. The roads were empty, his headlights the only source of light in the vast darkness. He drove fast, watching his mirrors, telling himself nothing was following. But twice he thought he saw something in the distance, a shape moving parallel to the road, too fast to be human, too large to be any animal he knew. He reached the lodge just after 9 p.m. The parking lot was nearly empty. He got a room, locked the door, checked the lock twice, then checked it again. His room was on the second floor. He left the lights on, pulled the curtains closed, and sat on the bed with his laptop open, reviewing the data again and again, trying to find a rational explanation that his mind would accept. Sleep didn't come. Every sound made him jump. The wind against the window, footsteps in the hallway, the ice machine cycling on. At 2 a.m. he heard something scratch at his door, soft, deliberate like fingernails on wood. He held his breath, staring at the door. The scratching continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. He waited for an hour before he dared look through the peephole. The hallway was empty. At dawn, his phone rang. Officer Begay. The search team had entered the canyon at first light. They'd found Lauren's camps, they'd found her equipment, but they'd found no sign of Lauren herself. No tracks leading out, no blood, no disturbance beyond what Christopher had already reported. It was as if she'd simply vanished. "We're expanding the search," Begay said. "But Mr. Hayes, I need to ask you something. When you were out there, did you see anything unusual?" Christopher thought of the thing in the valley, the impossible proportions, the wrong movements. He thought of the voice mimicking Lauren, calling his name. He thought of his entire education, his career, his commitment to rational thought. "Yes," he said quietly. "I saw something." "Describe it." Christopher did, expecting skepticism, expecting to be dismissed as unreliable. But Begay just listened. When Christopher finished, there was a long pause. "You should leave the area," Begay said finally. "Today. Go back to Flagstaff. File your report with the USGS. Let them know the location is compromised." "What about Lauren?" "Mr. Hayes, if what you saw is what I think you saw, Lauren's been gone for 11 days. If she was taken into the old ways, into those places where the boundaries are thin," Begay sighed. "We'll keep searching. But you should go, and you should probably talk to someone about what you saw. Not a therapist. Someone who understands." "Understands what?" "That the world is bigger and stranger than what your science can measure. My grandfather, I can give you his number. He's helped people before. People who've seen things they shouldn't have." Christopher took the number, thanked him, and hung up. He sat on the edge of his bed, watching the sunrise paint the monuments outside his window. Beautiful and terrible. He'd come here to find a missing person using grid searches and GPS coordinates and rational methodology. Instead, he'd found the edge of his understanding, the place where certainty ended and something older began. His laptop still showed the seismic data, the voice in the frequencies. He'd submit it to the USGS. They'd analyze it, find some explanation. Seismic anomaly, equipment malfunction, atmospheric conditions. They'd file it away, and Lauren would become another missing person statistic, another unsolved case. But Christopher knew the truth, and that knowing had changed him in some fundamental way. He could feel it, like a crack in foundation, spreading slowly. He wasn't sure if he believed in Yi-Nald Lushi, in skinwalkers and Navajo witchcraft, but he believed in what he'd seen, and he believed that the old man had been right. Some things shouldn't be measured. Some places demanded respect, not investigation. He packed his equipment, checked out of the lodge, and drove back toward Flagstaff. The October sun was bright, the sky impossibly clear, but he kept checking his rearview mirror, kept watching the rocks for shapes that moved wrong. And that night, in his apartment 200 miles away, when he finally tried to sleep, he dreamed of Lauren calling his name in a voice that wasn't quite hers anymore, from a place that wasn't quite part of the world he knew. The USGS closed the investigation 3 weeks later. Insufficient evidence to continue. Lauren Martinez was officially listed as missing, presumed dead from exposure or accident. Christopher filed his report, omitting the parts he knew no one would believe. He requested a transfer, got assigned to a monitoring station in Southern California, about as far from the desert as he could get while staying in the same state. But sometimes, late at night, his phone would ring with no number displayed. And when he answered, he'd hear breathing. Deep, wet, wrong. And once, just once, He heard his own voice coming from the other end, saying his name over and over like something had learned the shape of the word but not its meaning. Christopher stopped answering unknown calls after that. He never went back to the Navajo Nation. And he never spoke about what he'd seen in Sebi and Ziskai, because speaking about it felt like an invitation, like calling attention to himself from something that was still out there, still watching, still wearing the faces of the people it had taken. Some boundaries, he learned, existed for a reason, and some knowledge came with a price. He'd crossed into a place where his certainty meant nothing, where his instruments couldn't measure what mattered, where the old warnings he'd dismissed as superstition were the only truth that counted. And that knowledge would haunt him more completely than any ghost ever could. The knowledge that he'd been wrong about everything, and that the world was far darker than any peer-reviewed journal would ever admit. If this story gave you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in Christopher's place? Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most?